So every couple of years in NHL, an underrated team or an underdog squad makes it to the Stanley Cup final. It was harder back in the day because with the 1-16 format in the early 80s, it was rough for like a number 9 or number 10 seed to make it all the way to the final. But this was what happened in the 1981 season. The 1980 version of the Minnesota North Stars made it as far as the semifinal round by knocking off the defending champion Montreal Canadiens in the quarterfinal on a late goal in Game 7 by Maritimer Al McAdam against that Civ Denny Hanon. But the 81 Minnesota North Stars were prepared to make a run, and despite a kind of mediocre regular season, they knocked off Boston, Buffalo, and Calgary to advance against the Islanders and gave the Islanders fits until they were finally stopped in their quest for the Cup. Now, the 81 Stars, this was their 14th season. Although they finished the campaign with one less win and one less point than the previous season, they made a surprise appearance in the Stanley Cup final against the Islanders. We lost 4-1. Now, Minnesota was in a tough division with Boston, Buffalo, Quebec, and Toronto, 35, 28, and 17, plus 28. Now, ironically, they tied the Bruins for the same amount of points that year, but Boston had the home ice advantage because of 2 more wins. Now, the hot start to the season, there were 7-1-2 in the first 10 games. The only loss was against their eventual semifinal opponent, the Calgary Flames. So they only lost 1 game between October 11th and November 2nd. They also had a strong December, winning some key games on the road. Now, at one point, ladies and gentlemen, they were 29, 17, and 14 until a bad 5-game losing streak was followed by 5 losses in 7 games. So the record was an indication of how good they were. They should have won 40 games that season. Now, that year, of course, the phenom Bobby Smith had 93 points in 78 games, only a +1. But players like Tim Young, Al McAdam, Steve Payne, Tom McCarthy, the youngster Craig Hartsburg, the European Ken-Eric Anderson, Steve Kristoff off the Olympic program with 26 counters, and a young Dino Cicarelli or Ciccarelli, depending how you pronounce it, at 18 goals and 32 regular season games. Now, the idea about Minnesota that year, they had some strong defensive players. Now, of all the veteran defenseman Fred Barrett was still there, but defensive players like Mike Polish, Tom Younghands, Paul Schmier, Mike Fiedler made a great impression on their opponents. Now, the idea about the playoffs that year, ladies and gentlemen, here's the first round matchups. What a tremendous first round. The Islanders outlasted Toronto 3-0. St. Louis knocked out Pittsburgh 3-2. Montreal was swept by Edmonton. The Gretzky put them in their back pocket 3 straight. Rangers won 3-1 over LA. Buffalo shut out Vancouver 3-0. Philadelphia got by Quebec in a very rough series 3-2. Calgary knocked off Chicago 3-0. The Denny Savard Chicago. And Minnesota knocked out Boston 3 straight. Now, talking about that opening round series against Boston, Boston were the favorites going in. Again, they won the tiebreaker because they had 37 wins at 35. Now, they swept the Bruins in 3 games. Minnesota won Game 1 overtime due to Steve Payne's hat-trick goal at 3:34. The North Stars win in Game 1 was the first ever victory for the franchise in Boston, as they went winless in their 35 previous games in Boston over 14 season. Now, in Game 2, Brad Park and Dino Cicarelli both scored 4 points in a high-scoring 9-6 Minnesota victory. The North Stars also scored 4 times in the first period of Game 3 at the Met Center and did not relinquish the lead, leaving the Bruins with a 6-3 win. Now, this total series was a shutout, with Payne and Ciccarelli scored the first period of Game 1, with Marcotte replying in the first. Boston went ahead 3-2 on a goal by Dwight Foster and a power play counter by Peter McNabb. Steve Payne scored early in the third to tie it at 3. McNabb scored at 7:14 to tie it. Jack Carlson, yes, one of the Carlson brothers, 11:55, and Payne in overtime completing the hat trick. Jean Balache made 28 saves for the win. Game 2, the shootout, ladies and gentlemen. Brad Park opening scoring at 56 seconds, but Smith, Payne, and Al McAdam followed, with Terry Riley making it 3-2 after one. In the third, Peter McNabb tied it up, but from there, Brad Maxwell, Payne again with his fifth, and Al McAdam made it 6-3 after two. Now in the third, Don Marcotte scored at 29 seconds, but Cicerelli's second, Kevin Maxwell at 3:17, was followed by 2 goals by Keith Crowder to make it 8-6, but Young put it away at 14:25. Mako Baron replaced Rogie at for the third period, but he couldn't stop Minnesota's vaunted offense. Now the game in the Met Center, it was Brad Palmer, Al McAdam, Dino Cicerelli, and Steve Payne, 4-0 from the hometowners until Mike O'Connell made it 4-1. In the second period, Greg Smith scored at 18:05 a shorthand, but then Bobby Lalonde scored back-to-back shorthanded goals to make it 5-3, but Steve Payne, the seventh of the series, in an empty net at 18:34. Now, the series against Buffalo, it was the second playoff meeting for the two squads, as Buffalo swept the only previous meeting in 2 games in the 77 preliminary round. Now, Minnesota had won the season series, earning 5 of 8 points in this year's 4-game regular season series. Now, when Minnesota defeated the Sabres in 5 games, Game 1 required overtime as the teams exchanged a lead throughout regulation. Steve Payne entered the game just 22 seconds in the first overtime. To date, this is still the quickest playoff overtime goal in North Star history and tied for the 10th fastest in association history. Now, Steve Kristoff and Cicerelli each scored twice for the North Stars in Game 2, as Minnesota took a 2-0 lead with a 5-2 victory. Now, Buffalo goaltender Don Edwards made 43 saves in losing effort in Game 3, as Buffalo lost 6-4. Minnesota forced overtime in Game 4 after trailing by 3 in the second period, but the Sabres extended the series with an overtime win, as Craig Ramsey scored at 16:32 of the first overtime. Now in the final, Beaupre, just drafted, made 36 saves for Minnesota in Game 5 as they advanced to the Stanley Cup semis for the second straight year. Now, the opening game in Buffalo, Brad Palmer, also a draft pick that year, scored his second on a shorthand. Andre Savard and Lindy Ruff scored a second to make it 2-1 Buffalo. But in the third, Al McAdam at 1:46 and Steve Payne, he's 8, 11:58, followed by Ramsey's a game tire, and then Payne in overtime is 9th at 22 seconds. Now in game 2, Tony McKechnie opened the scoring for Buffalo, but then from then on it was the Kristoff show. He scored twice in the second at 14:47 on the power play, 18:17 on even strength. In the third, McKechnie with his second made it 2-2, but Cicerelli at 4:01, Bobby Smith at 9:59, and Cicerelli in the empty net wrapped it up for Minnesota. Now in the rough game 3, Alan Cicerelli with his 6, Brad Palmer and Al McAdam scored, followed by Alan Hayward at 18:10 on the power play. But in the second, Perot and Rick Sealing scored to make it 3-3. But then Kevin Maxwell and Neil Broughton answered to make it 5-3. Derek Smith made it close at 5-4, but Tim Young, with his second, the empty net, scored at 19:22. Now in the very, very competitive game 4, Jean-François Sauvé, back from Europe, of course, scored at 9:39. Perot made it 2-0 on his second at 2:04, followed by Alan Hayward at 6:35. But Cicerelli made it 3-1. Kristoff made it 3-2 on the power play, and then Payne his 10th, 1946. Going into the third, John Van Boxmeer put Buffalo ahead, but Bobby Smith tied it with 66 seconds left, which was followed, of course, by Ramsey's heroics at 16:32. Now back at the odd, Jean-François Sauvé, second of the season, but a rare score for Minnesota. Ken Solheim made it 1-1 after 1, and Ken Eric Anderson and Brad Maxwell made it 3-1 in the second. Al McAdam made it 4-1, but former Blue Bob Hess was followed by McKechnie's 5th of the series, and that was it for Buffalo. Now, advancing to the final, a lot of people felt this was something that was going to be a big test for Calgary, and it was. Minnesota won the opening game at the Stampede Corral, one of the last playoff games ever to be held there. Uh, Minnesota won the series in 6 games. Of course, it was the great Craig Hartsburg led the way in the first to make it 1-0 Minnesota. Tim Young scored his third at 4:38 before Poplinski replied for Calgary. But from then on, it was all Minnesota as Gordy Roberts and Al McAdam scored for the victors, both on the shorthand, to make it 4-1. Now, game two, Calgary made the comeback. Pekka Rakakallio scored his first of the postseason, followed by veteran Guy Chouinard to make it 2-0 after the first. Kurt Giles made it 2-1, but Kevin Lavallee scored the winner at 6:25. Now, Steve Kristoff replied on a power play 10:34 to make it 3-2, but it was all Calgary in this game. Now back at the Met Center, again another high-scoring game, 6-4 for Minnesota. Bobby Smith tied the game 1-1 just after Ken Houston scored his first of the game at 3:23. Brad Maxwell made it 2-1, and in the second, Bobby Murdoch, the Montreal Canadian Bob Murdoch, made it 2-2, followed by a goal by Bobby Gould to put Calgary at 3-2. But Steve Payne and Brad Palmer replied, making it 4-3, but Bill Clement scored at 17:40 to make it 4-4 after 2. But in the third, Kristoff and Smith scored back-to-back, Smith on the empty net, and that was it. Now, Reagan was very weak in this contest, if you remember that match. So in the game 4, Minnesota had every opportunity to do back-to-back in the Met, and that's what happened. Dino Ciccarelli, Steve Kristoff, and Bobby Smith scored for Minnesota in the first, and Pekka Rakakallio scored his second of the postseason in 9:26. In the second, Jamie Hisloff made it 3-2, but Ciccarelli scored back-to-back, his 9th and 10th, following by another goal by fellow rookie Brad Palmer. And in the third period, Kevin Maxwell made it 7-2, but Bobby Gould and Mike Dwyer within 15 seconds made it 7-4. That was it for the contest. And Reggie Lemelin and Reagan shared goalie duties. Now back in Stampede Corral for Game 5. Again, Calgary was hard pressed, but they did it on the heroics of Bobby McMillan's 7-8 to the season. He scored at 18:54 the first and 55 seconds of the second to make it 2-0. In the third, Willie Plett scored his 7th of the postseason, his first of the series, while Craig Hartsburg made it 3-1 late. And again, Pat Reagan was back in the Calgary net. But in Game 6, which secured the bowl, as we say, Calgary was no match for Minnesota, especially in the third period. McAdam opened the scoring to make it 1-0 for the visitors. Plett with his 8 at 2:57 on the power play got it done 1-1. But Ciccarelli, his 11th, 11:36 made it 2-1 after the second. In the third, key counters by Steve Payne on the power play and another one for Brad Palmer made it 4-1. Ken Houston scored at 15:07 to make it 4-2. Brad Palmer with a minute and 20 seconds left. He's 7th, second in the contest, made it 5-2. And Don Lever, the former Canuck, scored at 19:20, and the final was 5-3. Now in the Stanley Cup Finals, this was the first meeting between both squads. The Islanders made their second consecutive and second overall appearance in the finals, as they defeated the Flyers the previous year in 6 contests. Now Minnesota made their first finals in their 14th season, again after entering the league in 67, and this was coming off another semifinal berth, their second straight. Now Game 1 in Nassau Coliseum was all Islanders. They won 6-3, and this was a match that everybody knew was going to be interesting from the start. Minnesota won, had some momentum going in Game 2, but the Islanders wrapped it up with a 6-3 win, so back-to-back. So they go back to the Met Center, and Minnesota's defense couldn't stop the Islanders' offense. They scored their 19-goal series in a 7-5 victory. But on May 19, 2 days later, The cup was in the Met Center, but Minnesota held off the Islanders for a 4-2 score. And of course, Minnesota lost 5-1 in that tough game 5. Now, the idea about the Minnesota North Stars season that year, it was basically not what everybody expected, because Minnesota was strong enough the year before to go far, because they outplayed Montreal not only on Montreal's side, but it was a weird configuration, because the Minnesota North Stars were a mixture of some veterans, some good drafts, and Bobby Smith, the leader of the team, even though he didn't score much or get many points in the postseason. Now, Cicerelli, like I said, he became a household name because of that series, because Steve Payne was well known well before that series ever started, because he drove Montreal nuts in that 1980 series with that McAdam line. So in the playoffs, Bobby Smith had 25 points, only 8 counters, but the big boy from North Sidley did well. Timmy Young had 3 goals, 14 assists for 17 points. Al McAdam had 9 goals and 10 assists for 19 points. Payne had 17 goals, probably one of the best series he's ever had. He was scoring against the Islanders, couldn't make it done. Hartsburg had 3 goals, 15 points. Steve Kristoff, 8 counters in the postseason. Gino Cicerelli, big 14 goals, especially in the final as a 20-year-old. And the defense, Brad Maxwell, was quite strong. Now in the playoffs again, Montreal style play worked, because Minnesota was playing every team like they played Montreal in 1980. You give them their chances, but like a rope-a-dope. But Boston, Buffalo, Calgary, man, that was a tremendous run, because these were all 75 was a big year for Buffalo. That wasn't in the far past. Boston was 3 years away from Stanley Cup Finals. Calgary was coming on, because they were taking those young prospects like Poplinski and everybody else. And this was before Mike Vernon showed up too. So Pat Regan, I think, was one of the weak aspects of the team. But any Minnesota North Star fan can tell you, 81 was special, because who would have thought Steve Payne and Cicerelli would score 32 goals between them? 31 goals between them. And like I said, Bobby Smith and Al McAdam, all that know, like I said, that PI Nova Scotia connection. But a lot of players from the States on that team too, like Mike Polish. There was enough, and unfortunately, like I said, to beat the Islanders, no team was going to beat the Islanders. The closest team could have beat them that year, Minnesota, because they could match them goal for goal, but they couldn't overcome at Nassau Coliseum. That the fans were just nuts. I remember, I think it was Bob Cole who was announcing that, and he said, it's gonna be a rough go for anybody to beat the Islanders. And sure enough, it took Wayne Gretzky in his prime, 3 years later to do it, and it took everything they could, because the '83 the Islanders had enough to beat Edmonton. So, but Minnesota, like I said, until the Lemieux years, I always thought that it'll be Edmonton and Minnesota pretty well every year, but things how it goes anyway. So ladies and gentlemen, that's the story of the very good and the very solid 1981 Minnesota North Stars. If you like what we're doing here with our hockey podcast, let us know in a like, comment, subscribe, or share.